Hello everyone, welcome to the Yissilmissil Productions channel. My name is Yissilmissil, and today we will be continuing our deep dive series into the Chicago film industry. We'll be reading from chapter 4 in this book, which is the beginning of part 2 of the book, and this is part 4 of our series. So I hope you're all doing well today. So I'll remove myself from the video here for a second. We're looking at William Selig's studio. There's some newspaper articles. Hey Jason. Good to have you here live when you guys can make it. So yeah, we will be learning about William Selig, who started one of his film studios here in Chicago. So again, we're reading from Flickering Empire by Michael Glover Smith and Adam Selzer. We're starting on part 2, Chicago Rising. And we're on chapter 4, Colonel William Selig. And that is a title that he gave himself. So I would almost say it's a case of stolen merit. But if we can look beyond the fallacies of these individuals and focus on their roles in the industry, I think that would be the most constructive. So this photo says, in quotes, Colonel William, so Colonel, quote unquote, William N. Selig, circa 1914. And the photo is courtesy of the Margaret Herrick Library, Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. Thank you, Jason. Yeah, I wanted to spice it up a little bit and get some active background going. So this will be the one for this series. I do like using the film stock. Yeah, I'll stay down here in the bottom left corner for a little bit, and we'll see how this works. So this is a photo of, or actual multiple photos of relating to Selig in a studio. That's a studio with the road out front. I would assume that vehicle on the road is also someone related, or it could be someone just passing by or parked there for something else. But I just found these photos. I put them together here for you so you can look at them while I read. So again, we're on chapter 4, and this book is available to purchase on Amazon. I am not financially obligated for any of this. Like, I'm not a sponsor or anything. I just think this was a good resource to use, this book, and the one I currently have, I do forget how much I paid for it personally, but it's $80 on Amazon, but paperback it's $25, so it's a little easier. Oh, and there's also Appendix A in this book is Selig Polyscope's pointers on picture acting. So I really, I'd like to cover that as well today if we can. It's a little less than 4 pages for that. So I'll put a marker in here. Alright, so we're on page 41. We're going to read through page 52. And after that we'll do the appendix. And then that should be it for today. Next week will be chapter 5, George Spohr, George Klein, and the Rise of the Nickelodeon. So without further ado, Chapter 4, Colonel William Selig. Quote, when one says the Selig Polyscope Company, one really means the W.N. Selig himself, who is the president, or who is the presiding genius and leading spirit of the establishment. His eye is on every detail of the business at all times. And this is from Eugene Dengler, and the source is Motography, M-O-T-O-G-R-A-P-H-Y. William Nicholas Selig, pronounced Selig, was one of the most successful and colorful motion picture pioneers of the 1890s and early 1900s. Selig was a native Chicagoan and traveling magician who conferred the title Colonel upon himself while touring the minstrel show circuit. He was a large man with a bushy mustache and a friendly, ingratiating demeanor. An adjective used to describe the colonel on more than one occasion was Falstaffian, F-A-L-S-T-A-F-F-I-A-N. In 1895, 30-year-old Selig was in Dallas working as a phony medium in a stage show advertised as Professor Selig and his company of mediums, demonstrating table wrapping, slate wiring, table floating, and other seance tricks promising spirit power in full gaslight. To many believers, the phenomenon of mediums talking to the dead, a spectacle that emerged around the time as the early motion picture experiments of Edward Muybridge and Etienne Jules Mary, was the wonder of the modern age. It was while in Dallas that Selig saw a true wonder of the age, Edison's kinetoscope. Selig soon became obsessed with motion pictures and with finding his own way to create and exhibit them, and hence get around Edison's patents. Selig returned to Chicago, where he created in collaboration with machinist Andrew Schustek, spelled Schustek, his own camera and projector based on the design of the Lumiere's cinematograph. Selig named his camera the, quote, Selig standard camera, unquote, and his projector the, quote, Selig Polyscope, unquote. So his camera was the Selig standard, his projector was the Polyscope. In April 1897, operating out of a rented loft at 43 Peck Court, now East 8th Street between State Street and Wabash Avenue, in Chicago's brothel-strewn Tenderloin district, Selig founded the first Chicago studio, and indeed one of the first such motion picture studios in the world, the Mutoscope and Film Company, which became the W.N. Selig Company before permanently changing its name to the Selig Polyscope Company. The first Selig production, and what is likely to be the first narrative film shot in Chicago, The Tramp and the Dog, now lost, was a quote, backyard comedy shot in a residential neighborhood on the far north side of the city, known today as Rogers Park. The picture won instant popularity due to an accident that occurred while filming. According to various accounts, The Tramp and the Dog, approximately 150 feet long, or less than 2 minutes in length, featured the character of a tramp knocking on the back door of a residence looking for a handout, only to be met by a bulldog that chased him across the yard and over a fence. Before the genuinely terrified actor could clear the fence, the dog's jaws clamped down on the seat of his pants, and after a brief struggle, the actor tumbled to the other side, while the dog came away with a mouthful of pants. Thus began the long tradition of pants humor in silent motion picture comedy, which would arguably reach its apex with the films of future SNA star Charlie Chaplin. There is some debate over exactly when The Tramp and the Dog was made. There are no known newspaper reports of its first exhibition. Some sources date the production as being from 1896, while others, including Selig himself, have dated it as late as 1899. It is also possible that the film was shot in late 1896, but not publicly exhibited until the following year. Since the Selig standard camera was a modified version of the cinematograph, and the Lumiere brothers' representatives did not bring their motion picture equipment to Chicago until September 1896, it is a good bet that The Tramp and the Dog was not shot until the last quarter of 1896 at the earliest, and probably not until later. And I do want to mention, I think that first film, that first narrative film, The Tramp and the Dog, was found because I swear I watched it this morning. Yeah, like the same year that this book came out, it was found. So like after this was published, I believe. I believe that's what went down, unless it was a reproduction. I'll have to look at that, and that will be a must view for part 5. And I do have clips today for us to watch at the end of the Chicago Police Department that the Lumiere brothers got to walk down some streets as a parade just for them to film. Along with, there was one other one that I grabbed. So we'll look at both of those. And if I can find the Tramp and the Dog, the one that I'm thinking of, then I'll go ahead and I'll get that prepped for next week. Yeah, Jason. Jason says in the chat, it's wild to think how many iterations of invention we had to get to where we are. Yeah. With all of these different inventions happening around the same time. But yeah, they're even saying in the book here it's hard to tell who did what first. But it did look like they were all trying to improve upon everyone else's designs. And then that's where all the patent wars, the patent wars, when those came in, that was not good. I mean, I think that ended up causing Edison to be very greedy after someone basically got one up on him on that. That wasn't good for the whole. So anyway, I'm going to continue reading here. There's some debate over exactly when the Tramp and the Dog was made. Yes, okay. By all accounts, the Tramp and the Dog was a success, although it is difficult to know to what extent the movie circulated widely, even playing in Europe, where it was sometimes screened under the abbreviated title Tramp and Dog. Selig later stated, quote, "There wasn't a lecturer, carnival company, or circus that did not show it," unquote. Selig also wrote that he created literally thousands of prints of the film, a claim that is probably an exaggeration. He would likely not have had the finances at the time to do so. Each print cost approximately $13.50, and that's in 1896 prices. So whoever wants to do the math on that one. Per print. And we're talking like a 2-minute film print. $13.50. Also, guys, let me know if the audio is okay. I'm going to turn this up a little bit. Alright. What is indisputable is that the filmmakers in the United States, including the Edison Manufacturing Company, and in Europe, borrowed Selig's basic conceit, as a rash of humorous tramp-themed pictures soon appeared. These included such titles as The Tramp and the Giant Firecracker, The Tramp and the Baby's Bottle, The Tramp and the Crap Game, etc. Selig recycled images from the film himself as late as 1904 for his comedic production Serenade. Edison Manufacturing titled its 1901 imitation Pie Tramp and the Bulldog, which offered only the slightest variation on Selig's original scenario. and advertised it as, quote, one of the funniest pictures ever put on exhibition, end quote. The Colonel got his revenge by duplicating Edison's movie and distributing it himself. I'm going to reread that. The Colonel got his revenge by duplicating Edison's movie and distributing it himself. For the next several years, however, Selig put on hold any ambitions he had about producing narrative films and turned his attentions instead to a series of Lumiere's-like actualities that would be decidedly more exotic affairs. Yeah, or you could even say it's the tramps are the first meme, like the first video meme. I mean, technically. But yeah, I would also say it's sequels, the first sequels. In 1898, the Spanish-American War was all the rage in the American media. Edward Ahmet, inventor, filmmaker, and partner of George Spohr, reportedly appealed to the U.S. War Department to be given permission to travel to Cuba and document the battles. His request was denied, so Ahmet single-handedly invented the pseudo-documentary genre by recreating and filming the battles himself, based on newspaper reports in Waukegan and nearby Third Lake, pioneering films like the Battle of Santiago Bay, also known as Spanish Fleet Destroyed, not to be confused by the better-known remake of the same title by J. Stuart Blackton, were among the very first to use special photographic effects, such as miniature replicas of naval ships and painted backdrops of Cuba that stood in for real war footage. Taking a cue from Ahmet, Colonel Selig realized that that actualities depicting allegedly distant locales could readily be made without traveling too far from home. Selig's 1898 productions included a series of actualities depicting soldiers training at Fort Tanner in nearby Springfield, Illinois. And that series soon gave way to a slate of Ahmet-style Spanish war films. Selig even produced a movie about the washing of streets in Puerto Rico, a newly acquired territory of the United States, in an attempt to capitalize on a then popular media topic. A Selig catalog from 1903 cleverly describes the 1898 production of Washing the Streets of Puerto Rico as, quote, a very unique scene showing the method of washing down the streets in Puerto Rico and of special interest now that this country forms part of Uncle Sam's domain. This is a particularly brilliant film, perfect in every detail, and being something out of the ordinary has proved very successful, end quote. Washing the Streets of Puerto Rico, like Selig's Cuban Actualities, was filmed entirely in Chicago or its surrounding suburbs. All these films, however, were marketed as being, quote, authentic, end quote. Ironically, Selig used bold language to boast of the authenticity of his own films, while simultaneously attacking the actualities of other filmmakers for being, quote, fake reproductions, end quote. As in this catalog description of the Gans-McGovern flight from 1901, quote, with the exception of this film, there are absolutely no genuine moving picture films representing genuine prize fights on the market. The prize fight films, so-called, are either taken by the fight promoters. Okay, I apologize. So that's the Gans-McGovern fight. So Gans-McGovern. Quote, with the exception of this film, there are absolutely no genuine moving picture films representing genuine prize fights on the market. The prize fight films, so-called, are either taken by the fight promoters and retained by them for exhibition, not on sale, and cannot be procured, or else they are the boldest fake reproductions put up the day following the fight by cheap so-called fighters who endeavor to the best of their ability and under the direction of the enterprising photographer to represent or reproduce as nearly as possible the scrap which occurred the evening before between the genuine principals. It is easy to see how very little real value films produced in these ways possess for the average public, which is quick to see that the so-called principals in the fight are not the men they are advertised to be, and the fight is not the real thing. This is not only a genuine picture taken while the fight was in actual progress. End quote. The extant film of the Gans-McGovern fight offers a fascinating window into the process of early motion picture production, which could create unwelcome intrusions upon real life. The much-hyped featherweight title bout occurred on December 13, 1900, in front of an estimated 10,000 to 15,000 spectators. The fight was booked at Chicago's Tattersall's Athletic Association, which had outbid other venues across the country by offering the winner a $7,500 purse plus 50% of the box office. The bout was scheduled to last 6 rounds precisely because this was thought to be an ideal length for William Selig's motion picture. 6 powerful arc lights and 4 giant reflectors were placed around the ring to ensure there would be enough light for Selig's camera to achieve the proper exposure. The intense heat that resulted required that the giant doors to the hall remain open during the bout. Unfortunately, the median temperature was 24 degrees Fahrenheit in Chicago that night, meaning that patrons close to the doors and patrons close to the ring would have been made equally uncomfortable by experiencing temperatures at opposite ends of the spectrum. A final irony was that title holder Terry McGovern knocked out challenger Joe Gans in the second round of a still controversial fight that many feel had been fixed, bringing to light a scandal that may have been brewing in Chicago for years. Quote, "I know of at least 5 fake fights which have been conducted in the city," end quote, said one Alderman Patterson shortly thereafter. Quote, "Chicago is becoming the laughingstock of the country because of the ease with which a hippodrome can be managed here," end quote. Newspapers reporting on the fight frequently referred to it as a, quote, hippodrome, end quote, a word then going through a brief vogue in which it was a common term not for an arena, its normal definition, but for a fixed fight. So they were calling fixed fights hippodromes. The scandal that ensued resulted in Chicago's Mayor Carter Harrison Jr. signing an ordinance banning the sport for the next 20 years. If Gans-McGovern fight was indeed a, quote, hippodrome, end quote, how, quote, authentic, end quote, does that make Selig's film after all? If the outcome was predetermined, should this ostensible documentary not be classified as fiction? Also shrewd was the way Selig Polyscope used new catalog descriptions to make old movies seem more current. Infantry Charge, a war film from 1898, was being marketed in the 1903 catalog as a depiction of the Philippine War, which did not actually break out until a year after the movie was shot. To paraphrase Charles Foster Kane, Selig was providing the actualities and was content to let the United States government provide the war. This was exactly the kind of canny business sense that would establish the Colonel as Chicago's most successful film producer at the dawn of the 20th century. Soon, however, this success would also attract the wrath of Thomas Edison. And here we have a photo. It says the original Diamond S logo above the entrance of the sole remaining Selig Polyscope building in Chicago. And the photo is from Michael Glover Smith. I assume that's from his personal collection. So let's check that out real quick. Just the front of the building. So there's only one building left that remains. At least one remains, right? Alright, continuing on. The financial success Selig enjoyed with dozens of shorts he produced in the late 19th century, as well as revenues generated by film equipment sales through the catalogs of Sears, Roebuck and Company, made him a wealthy man. He officially incorporated as the Selig Polyscope Company in November 1900 with capital of $50,000. Edison sued for copyright infringement exactly 1 month later. Selig refused to be intimidated by Edison and hired the law firm of Banning & Banning to fight the suit. In an unusual arrangement, lawyers Thomas and Ephraim Banning agreed to represent Selig until January 1903 for a period of exactly 2 years in exchange for a large number of shares in Selig Polyscope. It was a wise decision. Financial statements show that Selig's profits surged in 1900 and 1901, making his films equal in popularity to any in America, including those being produced concurrently by Edison and the successful Philadelphia-based Sigmund Lubin. That's spelled S-E-I-G-M-U-N-D, and Lubin, L-U-B-I-N. Selig would later reacquire the Banning shares. For his official company logo, Selig selected the letter S inside of a diamond. This decision would generate controversy a few years later when, according to the Moving Picture World magazine, Russian border guards, quote, always on the lookout for nihilists, anarchists, and socialists, end quote, seized Selig materials after mistaking the Diamond S logo for a, quote, socialist emblem, end quote. The Moving Picture World responded by defending Selig in its pages using language that would not have been out of place in an official Selig Polyscope advertisement. Quote, if Mr. Selig is guilty of anything, it is in trying to educate and elevate the nations by means of decent, or by means of decent, clean, and moral pictures, end quote. Later in life, Selig would describe his 1903 production of Arrival of Humpty Dumpty as his first, quote, real, quote, movie. Let me reread that. Later in life, Selig would describe his 1903 production of Arrival of Humpty Dumpty as his first, quote, real, end quote, movie. However, the most significant Selig film from the turn of the century was the even earlier The Life of a Fireman, 1901, an impressive multi-shot narrative made at a time when most fictional movies still consisted of a single shot. Clocking in at 450 feet, or between 5 and 6 minutes in length, the film was a relative epic in comparison to other releases of the day. The influence of The Life of a Fireman could immediately be felt on the developing cinema in terms of both form, the ambitious editing of multiple shots together to create a more complex cinematic experience, and content, the dramatic depiction of a daring, quote, fire run, end quote. Among the important motion pictures influenced by Selig's early firefighter epic or the far more famous and still extant Fire from 1901, directed by James Williamson, and Life of a Fireman 1903, directed by Edwin S. Porter. Though the film itself is now lost, Selig Polyscope's 1903 catalog description indicates the life of a fireman consisted of at least 3 different shots and possibly more. Quote, "This picture, in its complete form, shows the fireman sitting in front of a firehouse when suddenly an alarm is sounded. You see the firemen rush and break for the inside of the firehouse to get to their respective places on the apparatus before going to the fire. The next picture shows them leaving the firehouse. The mad dash out of doors, and the most realistic fire run ever shown on canvas. 28 pieces of firefighting machines madly rushing and plunging down a thoroughfare on the way to the fire." End quote. Not all of Selig's early efforts were as innovative or ennobling. However, William Selig was first and foremost a businessman, and he had known the importance of generating a steady income since his days as a carnival huckster. The Colonel thus augmented his income by purchasing prints of European films by Yissilmissil and others, making duplicate copies. That might be pronounced Millet. It's been a while since I've said that guy's name. And selling them for distribution himself. So I'll reread that. The Colonel thus augmented his income by purchasing prints of European films by Millet and others, making duplicate copies and selling them for distribution himself. He thereby earned royalties on intellectual property that legally belonged to others. Selig was, however, hardly alone in this bootlegging of pirated pictures. The practice was widespread at the time, especially since it was virtually impossible for filmmakers from other countries to know if and how their movies were being distributed in the United States. Still, other Selig endeavors pandered to the lowest common denominator. The minstrel shows that were popular at the time, with their comical racial stereotyping, provided the basis for films with titles like A Night in Blackville, Who Said Watermelon, and Something Good, A Negro Kiss. The last of these is described simply in the 1903 Selig catalog as, quote, a burlesque, end quote, on Edison's famous The Kiss from 1896, i.e. the very notion of seeing African Americans, or more likely white actors in blackface makeup, kissing was meant to be humorous. It is worth pointing out that in the 1890s, Selig co-owned a minstrel company with a black barber from San Francisco named Lou Johnson. Although that arrangement does not excuse the racial stereotyping found in Selig's films, it was still a remarkably progressive partnership for the era. Such racial stereotyping in film would eventually lead to African Americans independently producing their own motion pictures, ones that offered alternative and more authentic images of black American life. African American filmmaking pioneer William Foster has been quoted as saying, quote, "Nothing has done so much to awaken race consciousness of the colored man in the nation as the motion picture. It has made him hungry to see himself," end quote. Chicago, too, would be home to the first significant movies made by African Americans, like the Foster Photoplay Company's short The Railroad Porter in 1912, and the earliest feature films of Oscar Micheaux. I want to say his last name is spelled Micheaux, the most important of the early, quote, race film, end quote, directors. And says see postscript. I guess I'll just read this footnote here. It would also not be long before motion picture studios began the more insidious form of advertising that would become known as product placement. SNA's 1912 production of Back to the Old Farm, for instance, uses a fictional narrative as a thin pretext for showing off the efficiency of the International Harvester Company's farming equipment. Okay, so that's a little later on. In spite of Selig's best efforts, however, Chicago was not yet the capital of motion picture production, as it would become later in the decade. In the first years of the 20th century, Chicago's role in the movie industry, as it was in so many other U.S. industries, was to function primarily as a center for distribution throughout the Midwest. In addition to Chicago's Sears and Roebuck, who sold projectors and slide presentations in their catalogs, with which traveling men like Burton Holmes would launch a career giving illustrated lectures, many other local companies catered to the burgeoning motion picture market by selling films and film equipment. These companies included Montgomery Ward, who had set up a special department catering to the, quote, optical trade, end quote, the Klein Optical Company, spelled Kleine, the Stereopticon and Film Exchange, the Chicago Projecting Company, and the Enterprise Optical Company. Thomas Edison sued or threatened to sue all of these companies. The only entrepreneur who capitulated was George Klein, who was able to pacify Edison by agreeing to exclusively sell Edison's films and projectors beginning in 1899. All of the other companies resisted, with some following Selig's lead and hiring the firm of Banning and Banning to fight the suits. This resistance was significant. Almost all of the motion picture production and distribution companies in New York and New Jersey, because of their close proximity to Edison and his patent-enforcing, quote, goon squad, end quote, agreeing to pay licensing fees to use and or sell equipment that resembled any of the devices Edison had patented. I didn't realize I was still all large on the screen here. Sorry about that. If they did not pay up, they soon discouraged. If they did not pay up, they were soon discouraged from continuing in the movie business. These practices allowed Edison to have a virtual monopoly on filmmaking in the northeastern United States, but arguably they also stunted the growth of the film industry there. That stagnation in turn allowed the Chicago companies, by virtue of being farther away from Edison geographically, to gradually build themselves up over the next several years. In 1901, Selig embarked on an ambitious series of movies that documented the local meatpacking giant Armour and Company. There were 60 films in the series, which were co-productions between Armour and Selig Polyscope, featuring such blunt titles as Weighing Mutton, Stunning Cattle, Stuffing Sausage, and Canned Meat Department. Number 6, Painting and Labeling. These are the earliest known, quote, sponsored films, end quote, a term coined by archivist Rick Prelinger to refer to movies made by a sponsor for a purpose other than art or entertainment and designed to have a limited shelf life. though one of the Lumiere brothers' earliest films also functioned as an advertisement for a beer company owned by a friend of their father. The movies in the Selig Armor series were essentially the first commercials. And that's where that product placement footnote was about earlier. In the coming years, Selig continued to produce locally shot movies while also expanding his operations to include film production in Florida and Colorado, where the climates were more conducive to shooting in the winter than that of Chicago. This was also the kind of thinking that would eventually lead Selig's opening to a permanent studio in Southern California in 1909, the beginning of Hollywood as we now know it. The most significant Selig Polyscope pictures of this period were actualities filmed outside of Chicago, such as the inauguration of President Theodore Roosevelt. Inaugurations always proved a popular draw and were one of the few big news events for which filmmakers could prepare in advance. And fictional westerns filmed on location out west, the most prominent of which was probably the incendiary Colorado shot Tracked by Bloodhounds, or A Lynching in Cripple Creek from 1904. In 1906, Selig Polyscope generated unwanted publicity when one of its contracted actors, Howard E. Nicholas, murdered one of its contracted actresses, Margaret Leslie. Wow. The two had co-starred in 6 films, including The Tomboys, a comedy directed by Gilbert Anderson shortly before he split with Selig to found SNA, and were scheduled to appear in a 7th, a Colorado Western, when Nicholas strangled Leslie in a Chicago hotel room. A newspaper article cited jewelry theft as the motive, but Andrew Erish's Selig biography identifies it as a likely, quote, crime of passion, end quote. It was the first of many such scandals to plague the burgeoning motion picture industry. Even as Selig's rate of production dramatically increased, however, so too did his legal troubles. His battles with Edison had never gone away, and in 1907 they actually threatened to bankrupt the Selig Polyscope Company. On October 24th of that year, a Chicago District Court judge ruled that Selig Polyscope's motion picture cameras infringed on patents that belonged to Edison. Fortunately for the Colonel, aid soon arrived in the unlikely form of his former partners at Armour and Company. In 1905, the socialist newspaper Appeal to Reason had published a specialized version of The Jungle, a novel by Upton Sinclair, that functioned as a damning expose of the unsafe, unsanitary, and downright corrupt practices of the Chicago meatpacking industry. And I believe that was forced upon my generation through the school system here in the United States. The novel was based on Sinclair's own experiences while working in the Chicago stockyards as an undercover journalist in 1904. Previous journalists found that the meat packers went out of their way to cover up anything unpleasant when they toured the premises. Sinclair found that by just showing up with a lunch bucket, he could sneak right in and never be questioned. When Doubleday, Page and Company published the novel as a single volume in early 1906, it reached a wide audience and caused an immediate sensation with the public. To combat Sinclair's unflattering account of the industry, Armour and Company waged an all-out public relations war. This effort involved re-releasing their Selig promotional films, as well as providing financial and legal backing to Selig in his lawsuit with Edison. The legal arm of Armour and Company worked towards reaching a settlement with Edison that would lead in 1908 to Selig reluctantly entering into an agreement with the Thomas Edison's Motion Picture Patents Company, which oversaw royalty payments to Edison while simultaneously allowing Selig to focus on his own company. With his legal battles with Edison seemingly behind him, Selig expanded his studio to include a massive lot on the corner of Irving Park Road and Western Avenue on Chicago's northwest side. The Colonel had already opened a second office there in the late 19th century, but now could afford to snap up all of the surrounding land so that his new studio facilities, bounded by Claremont Avenue and Byron Street to the south and east, would encompass several city blocks. These new facilities included outdoor stages, artificial hills, a giant man-made lagoon, jungle trees, and an interior studio with a glass roof. Selig made his old friend Tom Nash superintendent of the plant. Because the concept of a, quote, movie star, unquote, was still at least a couple of years in the future, it began with the Biograph Company marketing their leading lady Florence Lawrence as the, quote, Biograph Girl, unquote, in 1909. The main draw of the early Selig Polyscope films was simply their production values. Early advertisements used the impressively large, quote, Selig motion picture plant, end quote, itself, often illustrated in a hand-drawn picture, as the main point of interest of the movies, and only afterwards mentioned the skilled but unnamed, quote, pantomimists, end quote, in Selig's employ. One such ad earnestly read, quote, this plant is one reason why Selig films are the best. It gives no idea, however, of the great stock company of well-trained actors employed in making our films. We have hundreds of actors regularly employed, skilled pantomimists, and others are on call so that there can be no monotony in Selig films. We take more pains than anybody else to make our scenery and properties correct. The result is that we draw the largest crowds and give complete satisfaction. The making of our wonderful up-to-date pictures has been described by the biggest newspapers and magazines, end quote. As that ad indicates, the public at this time was still ignorant about how movies were made. An amusing item that appeared in the Daily Tribune in the late 1907 recounts the story of the filming of a bank robbery scene in a Selig Polyscope production. A woman who lived across the street from the suburban bank where the film was being shot thought that the actors playing, quote, masked and heavily armed bandits, quote, end quote, were acting suspiciously and called the police. A half-dozen Oak Park police officers soon arrived, arrested the cast and crew, and took them all to the city lockup. The presence of the bank president was eventually requested to get them out. Perhaps this story is what Chicago outlaw John Dillinger had in mind years later when, according to legend, he successfully pulled off a real bank robbery by making it look as if he were filming a movie. With more money and renewed confidence, Colonel Selig was prepared to ramp up the pace of his film production for the 1908 season. Selig Polyscope's membership in the Motion Picture Patents Company seemed to be advantageous to both Edison and Selig in the short term, but in many ways it would also signal the beginning of the end of the local Chicago film industry. And that is Chapter 4. We have one photo here at the end of this chapter, and it says Selig Polyscope movie set of a building's exterior, Chicago Daily News, 1914, courtesy of the Chicago History Museum. I'm trying to get it to focus here. My apologies. It's not wanting to do it for this one. Alright. So that's about it for today. There's this Appendix A. I do feel like saving it for next time. Maybe we can begin next week with Appendix A. Yeah, I think that'll be a nice lead into tomorrow, because then it also talks about Selig's competitors, George Spohr, George Klein, and the rise of the Nickelodeon. So we'll keep this under an hour today, and yeah, tune in next week, Saturday, and we will continue where we left off here. So that'll be all for today. Again, this is the book we are reading from. Tomorrow we are doing a general stream for this channel. So same time, 11 a.m., 11:05. Alright, everyone. You guys all know Tuesday we're doing another show on Coral Castle, and Thursday will be Bermuda Triangle. So, until the next one, class dismissed.